All right. What's good, y'all? Welcome back to the Onyx Report. Black Masculinist news for the day. Hope everybody's well. Shout out to everybody that's already jumped into the chat. Good to see y'all. I'm listening. What's up? Chef Mike, what's going on? We got Aaron in the house. What's up? So a few brothers in here already. Hey, Rue, what's good? Yeah, man. This is already starting out to be a pretty long week. I swear, I just sat down in my chair at 8 a.m. this morning. I've been grinding all day. So, conducting interviews at Fresno State for a couple of positions we're hiring for. That's a good 3 hours. Ugh, man, I'm tired. Got off, had to teach a class. So I'm just now getting out of class. And, one of the problems I keep having, I keep forgetting to eat. One of the, worst things you can do, I really got to get back on that because I will go all day and not remember. And when you do that, your body holds on to whatever you eat because it doesn't know when you're going to eat again. So I got to get out of that. But I swear a minute ago, it was 8 a.m. You know what I mean? So anyway, shout out to Chef Mike. Appreciate that support. He says, rolling up one before class, support the scholars. Much appreciated. But like, share, subscribe, join, and donate. Support the channel if you will, so we can continue to bring you this independent black male thought. Y'all know the deal. Help the channel out. Make sure that brothers are able to continue to bring you their work. I know things are getting tough out there. Seeing the news reports on how crazy things are getting. Make sure you support the channels that you watch on a regular basis. People need to continue to do this work, and it takes a lot of time. So you see the options on the screen. You know what it is. You got the Venmo, the PayPal, the Cash App. You can hit us on Patreon and become a monthly patron. You can support the channel, the Onyx Report on YouTube, and you can also support the Institute for Black Male Studies and the Onyx Network. You can support all three of them by becoming a patron of all three. So the Onyx Network, as you can see there, download on iPhone, Android, Amazon Fire TV, and Roku. So you can support in a number of different ways. So please make sure you do. But as I'm a little tired, I kind of just want to get this in because I want to make sure I stay in contact and provide some information that I hope will be useful to you. And a lot of today comes out of two separate videos. XX, appreciate that support. One video from my good brother, Dr. Ronald Neal, and another from my good brother, BGS. And so I'm going to play some clips from BGS because he dropped a fire video this morning in response to Dr. Ronald Neal. And I kind of wanted to add in a little segment of that if I could. So as usual, though, my system is always interesting when it comes to YouTube. So we're going to find out if you guys can hear what I hope to play. So give me a 1. I'm only going to play a second or two. Give me a 1 if you could hear it. Here we go. Oh, hold on. Let me turn this off first. There we go. All right, let's try this again. All right, so let me know if you could hear that horn. Give me a 1 in the chat if you could. Beautiful. All right, so we're working. So what I'm gonna do is just kind of respond to some of the things BGS was talking about, because I thought this was an important video. And if you haven't checked it out, please make sure you do so. Let me get the right one. All right, so it's called the Matrifocal Family of Black Women, and that's on his Black Pill Gnostic channel. So if you're interested in seeing the whole video, please make sure you check that. I will try to remember to put the link in the description box, but if I forget, remind me. Nevertheless, you got the title of it, the Matrifocal Family of Black Women. So let me get it in. So here we go.
Women want you to be wives. They want y'all to be wives. They want you to be in that ASAP Rocky position. You take care of the babies. You do the cooking. You do the cleaning. You do all the domestic labor and all that kind of stuff while she's out there being the breadwinner. She's out there being the provider. She's out there being the leader.
Now, this is real. This is something I've definitely seen. I've definitely experienced. But it's interesting because the way it works today, or at least from my humble experience when I was married, it wasn't that, matter of fact, most women I knew were revolted at the thought of being housewives. But simultaneously, they wanted to be home. They wanted to be void of any responsibility. They wanted to be taken care of, but they didn't want to be housewives. Those are two very different things. There's a difference between wanting to stay at home and actually taking responsibility for the home. And this is something that I've seen for the longest in terms of it being a problem. The other component to it that I've seen is you had women that wanted to work, but they didn't want their income counted as the house income. I've had women even actually say this to me, or at least attempt to, you know, which was met with a lot of laughter on my part. But as one woman actually said to me, your money is our money, my money is my money. So even if she makes more than you, the idea is that your resources cover all the expenses, and on top of that, cover all her fantastical desires. Right. As I've had other women tell me, well, I want you to take me on trips. I want you to pay for everything going on in the house, take me on trips, buy me clothes, do these kinds of things. But I'm going to still make the money I make, and I'm going to decide what I do with it. None of it will really be in direct access for you, but whatever, and I'm always quick to just walk out of that kind of shit. But my point is, it's put on the table for men as an expectation. So when he talks about this idea of this independent woman, the modern woman. Part of the problem with this idea is that you're still expected to cover everything, even though she doesn't want to be a housewife, but she also wants to work for herself or not work at all. But either way, there's no responsibility to what you're trying to build together, and there's no responsibility to contributing to resources in regard to the household network. So it's a real tricky kind of play on what they want.
And the Black female intellectuals, they will call it matrifocality. That's what the Black female intellectuals call it. They call it matrifocality. We have a matrifocal community, a community that is led, or community of households led primarily by women. And
See, now that's where it gets a little confusing because up until very recent, the very recent period, you'll never hear Black women talk about us actually having a matrifocal. You may hear some of the feminists use that term, but for the most part, they talk about it as a patriarchy. And this is usually a rallying cry to, kind of rally, this certain type of feminist mentality against this perceived boogeyman of Black men being patriarchs. But when you really begin to press them for what patriarchal period that they can point to, where men, Black men in particular, have had systemic power over Black women, what they'll often do is resort to pointing out incidents of individual abuse. That's where they go with it. Because they can't point to a period where Black men have ever had any sustained systemic power over anybody. The idea is that because we have penises, we somehow benefit from patriarchy, a patriarchy that's ran by white men, and somehow our benefit from this is systemic power that we can't flex, but yet and still it must be there. And so even in the university system, you can hear this rallying cry being repetitively fed to students. And when I talked the other week about the percentage of male and female Black teachers in the university system, this is why that 20,000 difference in faculty members is so significant, because the Black population in the academy is already small. I think I once heard it said around to be like 1%. It's extremely small. But when you factor in what percentage it goes on, you see a massive difference, right? A difference in the number of women versus men. And that was 10 years ago, where you saw a 20,000 person difference in the number of Black female faculty people in the university system versus male, right? That was 10 years ago, where it was a 20,000 person difference. If you look at the graduation rates for high school, college, graduate school, that number has likely done nothing but increase over that time period. So you get this kind of repetitive push where feminism, in my opinion, Black feminism in particular, has become a sort of religion. It's a religion where it's assumed to be true because people say it's true. And if you have enough bodies in the room that share that belief, it doesn't matter if you disprove it logically or not. It's there. People believe it. Ergo, it's true. And so if that begins to constitute the majority as they produce this anti-male, this misandric rhetoric that's all about Black female uplift and political mobility, they become oblivious to its effects on men. Because again, the rationale they're using to justify what they're doing is that they got to fight the Black patriarchy, even if don't nobody actually point out when the fuck it is, where it is, or who built it, whether it exists. None of that matters. The fact that they got to fight it is the only thing that matters. And so as long as you repetitively put that into place with larger and larger numbers of Black faculty, Black female faculty in particular, or Black feminist faculty in general, it perpetuates the idea of this big, bad Black male boogeyman, right? And this kind of feeds on itself. But here we go.
And the males in the household play a subordinate role in relationship to these women. They are supporting actors. They are not the star. Here's
Exactly. And shout out to BGS in the chat. What's good? Shout out to Dr. Thunder. Look, I've talked about this before. Dr. Thunder, appreciate that support, by the way. Shout out to Joe Herb for the support. Shout out to Dusty Nuts. He's right. So let's call it what it is. They want to be grown as children. It is what it is. But here's the thing. I talked about this, and some of you guys may have heard it because I think O'Shea has been replaying it a few different times in the last couple of months. I talked about the difference between son husbands and husband sons. And, I said son husbands are the biological offspring of women, and they're often forced to play an emotional role in women's lives that usually is reserved for boyfriends and husbands. But because they're the only males present and they're under the control of, their mothers, they end up playing roles that they really shouldn't be, roles that are inappropriate. And even though most often it's not sexual, there are instances where it can cross into a sexual line. But at the end of the day, a son husband is basically a biological son who is fulfilling emotional roles for his mother that should be reserved for adult boyfriends, significant others, and husbands. Husband sons are a different thing. These are kind of like these are men who are not performing as well in society as the women in question, and these women particularly go out to look for them, right? Whether you're talking about brothers who just got out the pen, whether you're talking about brothers that are been unemployed, live with their parents, and they're dealing with a woman making six figures, or at least has her own stable employment, her own stable place. And part of the reasons for that are systemic. I mean, for the most part, whether you go back, no matter how many decades you go back, if you're talking about poor women had greater access to welfare resources than men ever did. Middle class women had college access and white collar jobs to a greater degree than black men ever did. So the kind of low level stability is pretty easy for both poor and middle class black women to get. So it's not hard for them to find somebody that they're doing better than, right? Question is, how do they deal when they're dealing with men that are doing better than them? That's when the rubber hits the surface. And you find these women are often very uncomfortable because now they're held to a standard that they don't want to be held to. But if they can find a man that they're doing better than, they can control the dynamic. They can tell him to leave whenever they choose. They can make decisions on what he's going to do because he has no other options. Those are husband sons. And I think partly what Dr. Neal is referring to is that very dynamic right there. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about, Rihanna in this particular photo, but I'm saying in general, that's the dynamic at play, where you have well-to-do women, or at least stable women, who are looking for men who are not as stable, and from them they can secure anything they want: semen, sex, fun, companionship, even marriage, and will complain about the men they marry. You know, but those are the men that they choose, and then will tell you that's the only option, but it's not. It's not the only option. It's the only option that they've chosen. And part of the rationale there is something we've been talking about for the last couple of years, and that is what they've decided should be viable is so minuscule in terms of that, and really in any community. You know, it's such a small percentage of men that any man that doesn't fit that list, that desired list, is considered irrelevant. So they complain about this small percentage not being available enough, but the everyday dudes that are standing around them, some of whom make more than they do, just not significantly more. They're not making six figures. They're not making seven figures. They may only be making 5,000 a year more. They may make the exact same amount, or maybe a little bit less, but they're still at the same lifestyle. They're still at the same SMV level. They're still at the same, aesthetic, level as well. And none of that matters because the desired figure is virtually non-existent. I mean, I've been telling women for years, y'all looking for the same 3, 4 dudes in every city, and then mad that he has options that he uses. That's the end. But here we go. Let's see here.
Hey, my black pill brothers. You cannot make this shit up, right? I've been telling you guys for eons, I do mean eons, about the gynocracy and exactly what it is. And Doc just nailed it. He just nailed it. This is the Black Gynocracy. Now, Diane Stewart calls it the Black Africana Kinship Network. Dr. Johnson calls it the Gynopotestal Black Female Network. I call it the Gynocracy. And as Dr. Neal actually says, the Black female scholars call it what? Matrifocality. All these fancy names for the same thing. All these fancy names for the same thing. Now, Dr. Neal actually goes into more detail, whereas the white community, the white feminists are trying to replicate the same thing. They call it the end of men. They call it the richer sex. They call it a bunch of different things.
They do. I mean, really, especially when you look at white feminists for decades, they've actually they've held disdain for black women, and at the same time have needed them to kind of push their agenda. And in one vein, they also even envy black women's independence, but they also know the impact that shit has on families, so they tend to marry more. So there's a real love-hate relationship between white and black feminists, especially women in that regard. But they all do notice that there's an opportunity, and there has been for the last 50, 60 years, to really mobilize as women. And the primary reason for this, especially going back to the 1970s, is once women entered the workplace, they literally doubled the workforce. and they became an overnight new, market. That's what a lot of this comes down to. They became a new market, right? And they were a market that were more susceptible to media, more susceptible to purchasing in response to that media, and they became the focal point. Right. So that's where a lot of this power that we're seeing, particularly in media, is coming from. They are a market that is relatively new in American history, and they are being tapped. Right. And then, of course, as far as the country is concerned, they're a new taxable base. Right. So, again, an overnight new taxable base, relatively speaking. And so, that being said, that became the focal point. So, white feminists, in many ways, invited Black feminists to participate, all of whom were looking to mobilize women who aren't necessarily everyday, feminists. They're not necessarily many women who identify with feminist talking points and operate in a very feminist pattern have never actually read a feminist scholar or a feminist theorist. They couldn't name you 5 of them, right? But it's nevertheless something that they've been inspired to do, particularly through media. So whether you're talking about talk shows, television shows, movies, so on and so forth, these ideas have been so repetitively, marketed to women that it's considered a truth. That's why I call Black feminism a religion. Hell, I'll call feminism the same thing. It's a damn religion that doesn't need to be questioned. It's just assumed to be true because they said it was true, right?
Where they call the wife the supportive parent or the supportive partner, almost like the emotional support dog or animal, something like that. But no, and they call the so-called feminist, career feminists, the breadwinner, the breadwinning wives, or the breadwinning partner, or the lead partner. So there's tons of video. I'm not going to put all that stuff in here today, but there's a feminist that calls husbands like that, like A$AP Rocky, the lead caregiver, to make it sound nice instead of the wife or the role reversal. But Black women have been doing this for a very long time. We think the baby boys are. We think the homosexuals are.
Right.
Homosexuals are the wives, quote unquote, in that partnership arrangement. Black folks have been doing this forever. Black women have been doing this forever. Look at Jody and Baby Boy. He just wasn't formally the wife.
Right.
Okay, he was the concubine, but he was not formally the wife. This is not new amongst the Black community. It's not. The thing is that feminism has allowed a formal place in more of a accepting role of them doing this. And guess who the first people who are on the forefront of doing this is? Black women. As we call it, a matrifocal.
Exactly. Right. And this goes back to a very old tradition in many ways of making sure that men played a kind of servile role. That's why I call it a concuserf role, right? Concubine serfs. You're a servant, you're a sex partner, you're there to please her. And it goes beyond sex. Your whole entire role is about her. And that's one of the reasons that there's such a serious split on how relationships should even be thought about at this time, because really what men are starting to do is reflect on what they actually get out of all of this service, and this in and of itself is considered a no-no. You're not supposed to do this. You're supposed to continue to serve. Everything is about her, even down to the sex act itself, right? Starfish sex is real. That's you applying your labor, be it sexual, be it emotional, to pleasing her. That is the narrative. And if you break from that narrative, it's questionable as to whether or not you're a good man. See, all of these things are coming into question, and men are starting to ask basically the question of what exactly I get out of this. And that's why the whole notion of sexual marketplace value became so important a number of years ago, because in my lifetime, it was the first time I saw Black men aged 15 to 60 actually start to ask themselves, what exactly am I worth? What exactly is my value? And when we start, but we never had a standard for that, right? We were told our value was in making women happy, daughters, wives, you name it, mama. Making them happy was where your value was found. But when we started to actually question that, we found it was a one-way street. I recently had a post on my Facebook page where it was a text exchange, and it was a brother who was pointing out all the things he does for his ex girl, ex baby mama. She was definitely a baby mama, if not an ex-wife. But he was, pointing out all the things that he does for her, fixing her car, fixing stuff around the house, so on and so forth. But at the end of it, what he said was, I'm not really doing this for her. I'm doing this because that's the car my baby needs to ride in to get to school, talking about his child, right? And there was a brilliant point that one of the brothers in the comment section brought up. He said, it's interesting. Whenever we hear about these stories in regard to exes, we always hear about the service that men are either applying or not applying, right? Either men are doing this kind of work and labor for exes that they're no longer with, or exes are complaining about the work these men aren't doing that they wish they would. But he said, when's the last time you actually heard of an ex bringing a plate of food to the house because her ex-man needs to eat, the child needs to eat, and she just wanted to? And I thought it was such an interesting question because I really hadn't heard that raised much. In other words, there's not much raised about what exactly her supporting role would be as an ex, even if she's a baby mama, especially if the father has custody. What kind of supportive role can she play? It's not a question we hear a lot in the mainstream because, again, the focal point is about her, which in a way brings us to matrifocality, right? The focal point of the family in that regard is said to be the women. But we'll come back to that in a minute. Let me shout out, a few people who've contributed. Joe Herb, appreciate that support. Dr. Thunder, appreciate that. Let me see. Barry Hamilton, appreciate that support. Dusty Nut says, son husbands, this is the child Bernie Mac was arguing with over milk and cookies. Watch that skit. Okay. Shout out to Afro Nerd for the support. Afro Nerd says, greetings, Doc. BF platforms are normalizing this jazz. I hope you address the union/Wade BLM LGBTQ takeover at the expense of the black male's plight at the NAACP awards. We just aren't allowed to be protective of black masculinity. I got to check that. I was sent the video. I hadn't watched it yet. So give me a chance to do some catching up on that. But I was just sent that like an hour ago and I was teaching. So, and shout out to Marcus, because I think Marcus was the one who actually sent it. Orange Pill Nurse says, to your point about a man's money, single nurse sisters at my job were saying men should pay majority of bills, but women's money will be used for other family expenses. But man can't tell them how the women's funds are used. Exactly. And you're not supposed to ask. Adolf Caesar says, great masculine content. Much obliged, sir. Appreciate that. Dusty Nuts again drops another. Appreciate it. Says, shouts out to BGS giving the hard truth with a radio voice over a Quiet Storm instrumental. That's right. Shout out to Bureau Hammer for the support. Let's continue.
Focal relationship, which comes from the South. Like I said, the black family, as my partner put it, my friend put it, is a survival unit. And a lot of this adaptation that we had to go through for our kind to survive through the horrors of slavery and Jim Crow developed this. And they've been arguing about this for the last 100 years when they talked about the Black Matriarchy. I was just looking at another video from 1970 that talked about the Black Matriarchy and how offensive it was to women, even while they know they were doing this. It was embarrassing to black women to do this.
Mm-hmm.
But guess what they didn't do when they had the opportunity? They never gave it up. And you see with the covers, they just doubled down.
See, at the end of the day, when we talk about the Gynocracy, which again, it's interesting because whereas you'll have a certain subset of feminists that will acknowledge that there is some type of matrifocal, family structure, some type of matriarchal, whatever, most will deny it outright, right? And they'll say it's fantastical. And then if you press them hard enough, just like you saw in the 1970s clip that he's referring to, and if you haven't, check out BGS's channel. There's an interesting exchange about relationships that takes place on camera in the black community and what's going on with them. And they're having very, proto manosphere conversations about it at that point in time, because we're not making this stuff up. The stuff we're talking about, it comes out of the environment that we've all grown up in. Most of us have grown up in. So this stuff isn't new. But in that exchange, you'll hear women admit that there is a kind of matriarchy happening. And yet it immediately gets flipped in a certain kind of way. It goes from there is no matriarchy, you guys are making this up, because you hate women. And then it flips to, well, there is one, but it's a product of necessity because you guys dropped the ball and we had to stand up and be strong. So it's this real interesting kind of cherry-picked attack at black men on both ends. But the piece that they're missing to this and don't want to admit to is what I was referring to earlier. There has always been a level of institutional support that women have gotten that men don't. So we actually have women competing with us We're not competing with them. They are competing with us, but they refuse to acknowledge the institutional support they get while thumbing their finger in our face to say, we're not doing as well. You're not as reliable. Fundamentally, what they're arguing is that the individual Black man that has to compete with whether it's government, whether it's philanthropic support, whatever structure she's referencing at that point in time, and that even includes institutions, right? She has the capacity to leverage institutions, and if you don't believe me, go to a family court and sit in there for the day and just watch case after case after case. And you tell me who's leveraging institutional support, right? These courts are in their focus, gynocentric. They privilege women more often than not. Men are held under examination. Women can get away with quite a bit. That alone is an example of just one type of institutional support. And you can magnify that by adding in other types. So here you have women that are relying on systems of support that they have an inordinate amount of access to that men don't. And then turning around and saying to men, if you're not able to do as well as I am, or really better, you're a failure in and of itself. And then you got some brothers that'll pop in and say, well, yeah, they're right. We got to do better. As a motivational talking point, I ain't mad at it. But the reality is, if you look at the structural impact on the ground, if you look at the status and inherited wealth in our families, if you look at the status in employment, as far as employment is concerned, education is concerned, it doesn't work. And this is not just the case in America. You can find this in Africa. If you look at NGOs, non-government organizations that'll go into a given country, right? And they'll create a whole new financial structure based on what they're willing to extend to certain demographics in the community. You can see the impact that has on a relatively poor population. Anytime you have a poor population and there's now an institution that has sole control over a new resource, whether that resource is financial, whether that resource is economic, no matter what it is, if it's a resource that the people need and value, if they get to determine which demographics that they choose to allow access to versus those who don't, it's going to offset community relations in and of itself. And that's what's been happening in the Black community. That's the missing part when Black folk talk about all the impact that these various systems have had. We talk about racism, we talk about classism, we talk about colorism, we talk about all of these different dynamics, but nobody wants to talk about the ways in which women have been turned against men and have used and relied on resources that they know men don't get, and using that against men, or at the very least for their own benefit to the detriment of men, and still not being willing to talk on it. That's why, if you were saying this thing I'm telling you now, it's still controversial in the moment. Don't get it twisted. I got people that hate me for that. It already, right? But it's interesting. If you said this 10, 15 years ago, people would be staring at you like you just grew a third head. Like they wouldn't know what to go with, because that's how much we're not allowed to talk about this. We're not allowed to talk about it. We see it, we experience it, but hell, Black men, we didn't even have a language for it until recently. That's how much you weren't supposed to talk about it. You could talk about it in hushed circles, maybe the barbershop back in the 80s. But that was it. You couldn't really talk about it beyond that because it wasn't supposed to happen. You weren't supposed to. This was supposed to continue. And like I said, if it did get brought up, the first thing they do is tell you, first they really, here's the thing. There's 3 steps. First, they ignore you. If you make enough noise, then they tell you that you hate women. And if you make enough noise to where that doesn't work anymore, then they tell you there is a matriarchy, but it only exists because you guys are inherent failures. Those are the 3 stages that you're introduced to about this whole question of matrifocality. But let's continue.
BLM did was actually express what was already thought. It was already thought. Black men were never part of the Black family. They never were. Black fathers were always a resource. And matriarchy doesn't necessarily need fathers because the father's not really there for the
Oh, shoot.
concubine, but it was not formed relationship, which it comes from the South. Like I said, the Black family, as my partner put it, my friend put it, 100 years when they talked about the Black matriarchy. I was just looking at another video from 1970 that talked about the Black matriarchy and how
Sorry about that.
Matriarchy doesn't necessarily need fathers because the father's not really there for the male leadership role. It's always done by others, which is why there's videos begging black men to do what? Provide a male leadership role to women that have babies out of wedlock, that have boys out of wedlock.
So in other words, we're at a place where, because fathers and men in general have become so expendable, so disposable, and really here's the component, interchangeable, right? And this is something I grew up with, even going through the 80s and the early 90s. Men were so interchangeable, it didn't really matter. You know, if a given woman was with a man, she had other men to play certain roles in young men's lives. The problem didn't really hit a fever point until men started to withdraw, and ask the question, what do I actually get out of this? Now, this became a huge point of contention, especially when you're talking about building the Black community. If men are not going to play their role in families that they didn't create, didn't have a word in, and hell, truth be told, even when you looked at families where you did have biological offspring of a man and woman, a lot of the time, outside of sex itself, he didn't really have much more input in terms of deciding whether or not he wanted a family. Right. And people talk about, oh, well, he just should have wore a condom. Understand something. If you're with a woman for 1 to 5 years and you guys have an understanding, you've had conversations about, I'm not ready for kids, or maybe I don't want them at all. She agrees, she understands, right? She's on all kinds of birth control. You're on condoms. After a while, you get comfortable. Be with a woman for a year or two. How many brothers you know are still wearing condoms at that point? But somehow it magically happens, right? And then the question is, are you going to step up and be a man? But nobody actually looks at the dynamic. How does that actually happen? Did it happen because it just magically did so? Or did she decide at a certain point that she wanted something and took advantage of a sort of agreement that two people could have? See, we never talk about that. And I'm not saying that that's the predominant narrative. What I'm saying is, when we look at the narratives behind how an unwanted quote unquote family kind of comes about, it's always placed on whether or not he wore protection. You never really hear women say or admit to how manipulative they can be, even though they have over 30 different types of birth control, or 5 different types over 30 different forms. They have all kinds of it. For men, you got a piece of rubber. And at the end of the day, when these pregnancies take place, men are blamed for them. But at the end, but you really got to ask the question, well, if we've been having regular sex for years and nothing's come about, why now? Who decided that? How much input did he have outside of sex itself? And we're comfortable leaving the discussion at blaming him because he had sex. Like, we're comfortable with that. But again, we like to tap dance around holding women accountable for their role in this, as if they don't have a biological drive either. Our biological drive to have sex is rooted in reproduction. Her biological drive to have children is rooted in the same thing. We act like women don't have it. And when they decide that they want a child, whether it's logically a good thing to do or not, we treat it as if it's only the man making this decision. Again, I understand that when you're talking about a motivational space, when we're trying to get men to be accountable, nothing wrong with it. Had that discussion. Yeah, strap it up, stay controlled, do what you got to do. But at the end of the day, there's more to this dynamic than even we talk about. But again, we never want to hold women accountable. We don't. Let me see. All right. So shout out to Great I9. He says admission of the Matriarchy or Gynopotestal Family framework would necessitate recognition of Jim Sedanius' social dominance theory. Real talk. Absolutely. It would. And if you start talking about Jim Sedanius and social dominance theory, you find that these patterns are rooted, for the most part, any group that dominates another, there are certain relationships between two opposing groups of men. There's certain relationships that take place with the women of the ruling group, the dominant group, the women of the subordinate group. There are patterns in behavior that are very human that we don't talk about. That's real talk, right? So let me see. Great I9 continues. He said recognizing social dominance theory would require academia and politics in the country to rework how we frame the problem in America. Right. But it goes against the incentive structure we have in place, where resources are dependent upon how many women can receive support and how many men can finance that support through the system. Right. That's the structure that we rely on. Here we go.
Because that is the normal Gynopotestal, Matrifocal, Gynocracy, Africana kinship network role that men are supposed to play in this society, in this culture. And they're getting hostile and pissed that black men won't step up and do it. I was just looking at another video from the La Peace where this woman who says she refuses to be a partner or a wife to a man that has children. She didn't want a ready-made family. She wanted to start her own with a man that was childless. And he had a woman arguing with her because she really wasn't arguing for fathers that have their own children, because that's not the case. The thing is that she was saying that even though there's a lot of women in our culture that have already made the mistake, decided to be single mothers, decided to have children without partners, that they're already here. And what about the children? We need to clean this stuff up.
Right. So in other words, you're useful when you're useful. But at no point in the discussion are men asked what they want, what they value, or what they need. And when men begin to ask that question, it begins to present a problem, because at some point you have to take stock in terms of who was even conceptualized to get something in the relationship. You're supposed to, as a man, be happy that you have a woman. That's it. She has a list of things that you need to do. You're supposed to be happy that she's there. And this kind of fairy tale, it's starting to break down, thank God. But one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this is because when we start talking about these terms, matrifocal, matriarchal, gynocracy, gynocentric, and gynopotestal family, we talk about these terms. They're not necessarily as interchangeable as they sound, but they are a product, I think, of men having dialogues that we were never really able to have publicly, and we're starting to. And so I support that. Now, at the same time that BGS was doing videos on the Gynocracy, when I was working on a manuscript that I wrote in 2015, I was on sabbatical and was writing about, I was talking about the Gynarchy. And I was doing that because we were talking about these things at the same time, and I didn't want to assume what BGS meant based on what I meant. So after some discussion, he basically, we agreed on what we were talking about. And essentially what we were, I guess the shorthand of what we were referring to was what you might call a female patriarchy in the Black community. But again, none of this is biological. None of this just comes out of the sky. This female patriarchy, which we kind of referred to as a gynocracy, is rooted in a resource network that's established by the ruling elite, established by the powers that be. At the end of the day, this is not something that was produced organically out of the Black community. It was always influenced by policy. And this is why I'm always talking about policy. You can call it white supremacy. You can call it the ruling elite. There's so many different terms as to where we can talk it with. But my problem is, as soon as you say white supremacy, people go, that's such a loaded term. They go where they want to with it. I use policy because I'm specifically talking about a power dynamic that comes out of out of a structure, right? A structure that's producing laws and producing precedent as far as how resources are distributed, who has access to them and who doesn't. These kind of things have a direct impact on men's quality of life and what kinds of options are available to you. Now, it's not the end all to be all. This is why Passport Bros has become so popular, because you now have the option to leave. It wasn't always the case, and especially in the dynamics we're talking about, but it's there. And so now more and more men are looking to options outside of this network because the game, as it were, is fixed. Right. So that said, when we start talking about the gynocracy as a female patriarchy that's supplemented by the state, it's not that Black men woke up and they were just weak. Black women woke up and they were just super strong. It's not that. It's that this has been financed, and it has happened in waves over centuries. Right. We could talk about it on the plantation. We could talk about it during World War II. We could talk about it, beyond. I mean, there's so many different periods. We can talk specifically about the kind of policies that advanced, right, this idea. And by the time you get to the 60s and 70s and the advent of feminism, especially as an attempt to distract the country from the civil rights movement, right? This has huge power in terms of shifting resources, baiting and switching the discussion. where when white women decided that they were minorities, then the discussion that all of the momentum from the civil rights movement ends up shifting to their favor, and Black feminists end up supporting that dynamic because they stand to receive support on the coattails of white women that Black men are not going to have access to. That's the critical point in this. So when we're talking about this dynamic, I wanted to explain very briefly why I use the root term gyno as opposed to matra, right? When you talk about matriarchy, when you talk about matrifocal, the focal point is on the woman, but it's on the woman in a very particular state. It's on the woman as mother, right? So when we hear about women-led societies, when you research it, you usually hear about matriarchy. You hear about the mother-centered dynamic. And matriarchies are very different around the world to the extent that you have them. They don't function like the way we generally think of a patriarchy, just with women in charge. They're a lot more nuanced than that, especially in different places in Africa. It's a different dynamic. But we talk about the gynocracy because we talk about a very patriarchal framework applied to the Black community and supplemented with resources that are tangible, that that literally put food on people's table. This is where the rubber hits the road. It isn't theory anymore. You can eat or starve based on whether or not you fall in line with this dynamic. But I'm going to show you why I refer to gyno as opposed to matro. Right. This is a clip that I posted on my Facebook page a couple years ago. I don't even know the guys involved, but check it out and tell me what you think.
And the family function. And as a guy, you get a phone call. You show up. That says, hey, we're doing this, and this, and this. Mm-hmm. And the only thing you have to decide is if I'm coming or not. Oh. I'm the third oldest child. Why is my 10-year younger sister's voice mattering more in that conversation than mine's already? Why does that take place? And listen, it's something, like I said, we don't think about it because my grandmother and her aunts and her siblings did it. My mom and her siblings did. Now my sisters are doing it. And I used to sit and wonder why my grandfather sat in a chair and didn't say nothing. Same thing. And my brother and me both said, I understand now. And that's not saying I agree with the man's actions. I understand why dad left in some ways. Gotcha. I understand.
Okay, so I know it's a very short clip. I hope the sound came through as well as it could, right? But I think some of the things they pointed out, of course, don't apply to every single family. I hate this every shit standard that we have when we have these discussions, but it happens enough to where we have patterns we could recognize. How many of us saw grandfathers and great-grandfathers that sat in the chair in the living room and smoked a pipe and basically disassociated from everybody, who sat on the back porch when their family reunion was taking place and didn't associate? He went to work every day, maybe even for 40, 50 years, and that was it. And the women made all the decisions, right? And gave him hell on a regular basis, right? But how many of us saw those men? What this clip starts out talking about are men who he's talking about his little sister and how she ends up being pulled into this, what I've referred to as this Gynopotestal family structure, which I'll explain in a second, where she's in a position to make decisions with the elder women of the family, even though she's years younger than him. And he was never consulted about being brought into the leadership structure of the family because it's conceptualized as mainly female, right? The males, as a matter of fact, are not thought of as a part of the dynamic. You are there to be a workhorse. You are there to be told what to do. You are there to financially improve the family with whatever you go out and do. But you're not in a position to make decisions, and you're not asked to be, right? And this has been, as he was saying, handed down from grandmother to mother to daughter to granddaughter. This assumed family structure where you take a subservient role, but a role where you're either a financial provider or you're a concuserve. You are a husband's son. You provide her with a different set of resources, right? Instead of providing for resources that would, normally put another person in a position of authority, you provide resources that, satisfy a need she may have in a given moment. The problem is all of us are vulnerable to just being released, taken to court, and fleeced for whatever we have. And that's one of the things that's going to make marriage in the West hard to renegotiate, because until the policies change, until the laws change that provide some checks and balances that actually, offer men options beyond just hoping she doesn't decide to divorce you on a day-to-day basis, until those things change, men remain vulnerable, right? But in this kind of dynamic, what we're hearing, this is a passed down structure. And the reason I refer to gyno as opposed to matra is because it's not necessarily women-centered. Mother-centered. Listen to what he said. He said, my younger sister was brought in to make family decisions, and I was told what the decision was and what I needed to do, right? It was his younger sister. It's not mother focused, it's female focused. The girls are being prepped to lead family, the boys are being prepped to be workhorses. This is the dynamic. Even if you're intelligent, even if you got a college degree and you earn a good figure, you're just considered a better workhorse. Whether you're blue collar or white collar, if you make good money, you're a better workhorse. But again, your money is our money, her money is her money. And that's been passed down as a reality. And it's ironic because that necessarily wasn't the case when you talked about my great-grandmother's generation. But my great-grandmother and my grandmother wanted their daughters to be in a position where they could be independent and did not need to rely on men. What many of them didn't expect is what would come from that culture. Because even those women will shake their heads at the younger women, but won't acknowledge that it was their desires that spawned this, their desires that rolled that snowball down the hill. And now it's become something unreasonable. And it's become something that men are finally walking away from. Men are no longer satisfied with being the grandfather that works for 50 years and all he asks for is to sit in his chair, watch the game, and smoke a pipe and be left alone, while the women make all the decisions and tell him what to do. And then turn around and tell you at the family event what you need to bring, but you're not in a position to make any, authoritative decisions. See, this dynamic is shifting. So that's why I refer to it as gynopotestal. Now, gynopotestal is a very specific type of family structure. See, what I noticed a number of years ago is you actually had, they're almost like pods or cells in a Black family, where the leadership structure went from woman to woman to woman in terms of household. And the men were interchangeable resources. You could bring those men in, you can send Bobby over there to fix her sink, right? Send him back over to, to the other woman's house to fix her car. He needs to help such and such with her rent, right? A wife could leverage her husband to satisfy the needs of other women in her family structure. But he's not the head of that family. She is in terms of that particular cell. So each of these separate households were linked. And I kind of thought about this when I was dating this woman. Well, dating is a little much. It was one of those have coffee and see if your picture looks like it did online. So anyway, that didn't last long. But we had a discussion that I thought was interesting. And sometimes when I switch into sociology mode, I forget everything else. I probably gave her the impression I was far more interested in her than I was, but I couldn't get away from this discussion because she started talking about how her mother lives 2 or 3 houses down. So her mother, and I guess her one of her brothers still lives with her mother. She had 2 or 3 kids, one of whom was an older son. Her sister lived around the corner and she had a daughter and a son. And she was talking about her family in regard to this network of households. And the men were constantly out of work, hard to drive, had very little ambition of their own. But in each scenario, those men were sent to each woman's house to provide a certain type of resource. And that didn't include the men that some of these women were dating, where those men were brought in and they provided temporary resources until they started to make demands that weren't consistent with where this group of women wanted the family to go. So if you met this woman and you got with her and you decided you wanted to marry her, but in marrying her, you were deciding that you're going to move to a different area and take on a different life. If it didn't reinforce the family structure she was a part of and she was comfortable with, you had to go. But your resources were welcome. And here's another twist to that. If she had kids and you dated her for a while, there was still an expectation that you still provide a certain type of emotional and financial labor for her kids long after the relationship is over. I've gotten calls from ex-girlfriends about whether or not I was taking their kids to Disneyland. And I'm like, I ain't seen you in 1.5 years, 2 years. What are you talking about? But it was an expectation. And it was an expectation that was rooted in an idea of what men's roles were, not as husbands, but as interchangeable resources. And even though you're not in a relationship with her and there's nothing you get out of that dynamic, the social expectation that you still come back and provide for her and her children was still there. And more than that, it was also an expectation that you also serve a father role to her children when needed. And what do I mean by when needed? Usually when it's most egregious. When it's most egregious. When it's a 6-year-old boy that's out of pocket, she takes care of that herself. You don't get to be involved. And that's when you actually want him. She'll call you when he's 16 and he about to hit her upside her head. That's when you're supposed to come in and wring his neck. But she decides when you come in. So you're trying to say, I need him at 6. I need him to stay with me. That way I can make sure by the time he's 16, he's together. No, you're going to be too hard on him. You're not going to know how to parent him the way I want him parented, but she'll call you at 16 when he's acting a fool. And you're supposed to come in and drop the hammer. But even if you do that, once she feels the situation is back under control, you got to go. Now the check, the payment you need to make every month is still there, but you come and go at her behest. See, this is what BGS is referring to. This is what Dr. Neal was referring to. When we talk about this, whether we're talking about the Gynocracy, which I think is a larger systemic thing, and the Gynopotestal Family, which is one form of family network, but it in my opinion, has become the dominant form, especially when you consider that it's linked to single parenthood. And only 2 to 4, I think it's something like 4% of single parents are black male led families. So the more we have the single parent network, the more the Gynopotestal family holds sway. Because again, it's a collective of women's households. And here's the thing. If you marry a woman and you come from a Gynopotestal family, and she comes from a Gynopotestal family, now you have networks of women negotiating your relationship on both sides. I had this happen in my own marriage. It was hilarious. I had people calling me to make sure that I was treating my wife right, that I was covering what I need to cover, I was doing what I need to do. And here's the interesting part. It was not just the women in my wife's family. It was the women in my family. They would call my wife to see if I was doing a good job as a husband. They wouldn't call me and ask me, am I happy in my marriage? Especially since that was the only time I'd ever been married. You would think your own family would call and say, hey, how's marriage going? How you feeling about it? No, they didn't call me. They called her. Her family called her. My family called her. The only time somebody called me is if a bill wasn't paid, which occurred when I was in graduate school a number of times, because I was floating 4 jobs and I was in graduate school trying to finish my doctorate. And, if money got tight, that was the only time I got a phone call. Right. And even when they came over, it's hilarious. They would come visit for family events or whatever. I'd be in the office working on my dissertation, feverishly trying to get something done. And I remember having female family members from her family coming in to tell me about how I need to do a better job of bringing the dishes out of my office into the kitchen. And I found that interesting because I'm like, I'm working 4 jobs just trying to keep all of this floating. She's not working at all. And you're going to stop me from writing my dissertation to tell me how to better bring it's a trick. But my point is simply you end up in these networks of women-led cells, and you are a cog in that. And if you stand up to a point where you make it clear that that's not a system you're going to participate in or defer to, you become a problem, at least until you're needed. And when you're needed, you'll be asked to step up and provide resources, but you won't be asked to help make decisions. They consult you when you're needed. They don't consult you about decisions, especially when those decisions could have changed the situation or prevented a situation from going in a direction that was problematic. It's not even a thought that you may be able to provide an alternative logic that may change the course of how things may go. Even when you see this stuff early on, you try to speak it out loud, you're dismissed. Your words will fall on deaf ears in far too many a situation. And again, so when we talk about men deciding, black men in particular, deciding to change the structure of what types of families they choose to participate in, part of the reason for this is there are so many levels of disrespect, so many levels of exclusion, so many levels of men being made interchangeable resources with their humanity not even being reflected upon. That it goes beyond just going to another country looking for sex. See, that's the comfortable dismissal. That's the comfortable attempt to dismiss what black men are actually grappling with. And some brothers fall into this too. We actually think it's all about sex, but more often than not, they think it's all about sex. And again, I've said this before, I don't have a problem with brothers traveling for sex. Everybody seems to, even though black men seem to be given the face of it. I think if you look at the works that we've seen lately, especially Dennis Sperling's channel, we've seen evidence of black women long since doing this passport bro thing, but having the nerve to be accusatory when it comes to black men who choose to travel elsewhere. But I think what they're also doing is they're using this shaming tactic of men going elsewhere for sex to really, you know, to complicate and cloud the realities of what black men are actually starting to take issue with. It's never just been about sex. If you go back and watch Al Grease's early film, Frustrated, and you really look at the interviews in that film, sex is a factor, but more often than not, you really start to hear peace. And the peace isn't that, you know, other women are capable of something that women here aren't. It's not so much that. It's more that the women here have been socialized not to consider your peace as a relevant factor in the first place. Everything is about what they want. But to go somewhere else and bypass all of that, to find people who are socialized to treat you based on who you are. Now, that doesn't always mean that you're going to be happy, especially if you're an asshole. You might just get treated like an asshole. But here's the difference. You're treated like an asshole because you may actually be one. Whereas here, you may often find yourself dismissed simply because you're a man. It's not necessarily because of anything you've done. It's because of the social role that you're expected to play. And you can't have these conversations in certain spaces, especially the academy, because you're supposed to concede the point. You're supposed to defer to women's perspectives and leave it at that. Whatever they say happens must happen because they said it happened. And when you point out what men are talking about having happened to them, it's fantastical, it's made up, and it's just rooted in misogyny. That's the problem. So there's a lot going on with this. But I really want brothers to be able to articulate their concerns beyond the surface level. But, you know, it's twofold. One, we're primarily having conversations with ourselves that other people are coming into and using shaming tactics on. That's the first thing. But when we do engage in dialogue with those who are not black men, I want brothers to be as articulate as possible about what it is we're doing, why, and what we're experiencing. And I said this on Dr. Thunder's recent show. Dr. Neil, Green Gorilla, BGS, and I all went on his show this past Sunday, and he wanted to do a Black History Month, session, so we did. But one of the things I said on there is my purpose so far on YouTube hasn't really been to set direction per se for black men. My goal has been to provide a vocabulary that we can use to articulate ourselves and think about our condition. Therefore, when we decided on what strategies we wanted to use, what solutions we wanted to use, we had a terminology of our own. Because again, remember, when I was in grad school, if you talked about black men's needs, I was told that I needed to use feminist terminology to do so. So I had to find a way to put this round peg in a square hole to try and make it fit. And it never did. This is what the importance of the man not was, or at least one aspect of it. It was important because it helped to justify an alternative logic and vocabulary, set of terminology that allowed black men to explain their situation with a different historical narrative rather than the one we were prescribed to use. So that's what my purpose has been on YouTube, to try and create the language. And here's the thing, even if I don't agree with the particular brother who wants to use it, right? I haven't put myself in a position to agree or disagree because my focus was making sure we had a damn vocabulary first. How the hell are we going to agree or disagree about shit if we don't have the terms to even explain what it is we're experiencing? That's the position I took on this channel, to attempt to create that vocabulary. Because here's the thing, I don't care if you are a hardcore black revolutionary or if you are a hardcore black conservative. I don't care if you're a Muslim or you're a Christian. I don't care if you're rich or you're poor. I don't care if you're from California or the Bronx. I don't care about any of that when we can all tell the same goddamn stories about our relationships and the way the state plays into those relationships by supplanting you through providing her resources that you don't get. So my thing is, we have to first be able to communicate with each other using a terminology that we've crafted. And then as we start to debate about what the solutions are, can we do so with a realistic view on what actually has been happening? Because here's the thing, I don't care whatever your ideology for success is for the Black community or for yourself. If you can't form functional partnerships with women, let alone build family in a functional fashion, it doesn't matter what your goddamn ideology is, it's going to fail. I don't care. If you can't sustain a relationship long enough to have children that you can raise in a functional fashion, how the hell are you going to talk about any kind of liberation or anything else? It doesn't work. Whether you are trying to wholly participate in American society or whether you want to start your own country, it doesn't fucking matter if you can't get the basics of family formation down because she's been enticed by resources that you don't get. She knows full well, especially in California, what happens if you've been married for 10 years. She knows what your paycheck check looks like. I had a female financial consultant tell me that once. She said, women are so good at this shit. She said, Hasan, I can tell. She said, my girlfriends can tell you what your pension payments will be when you retire from Fresno State. She said, not me as your financial consultant, which I had hired her for at the time. She said, my girlfriends could tell you what your pension is going to be. That's how cold the game is. Women are not playing, and men are starting to figure that out. And people are not liking the strategies that men are taking to. So I really wanted to kind of add something to this whole question of matrifocality, matriarchy, gynocracy, gynopotestal. The gyno portion of it has more to do with women-centered as opposed to just mother-centered. And really beginning to look at on the ground what's happening with Black families rather than opening a book, taking whatever we hear in the book and trying to assume its application to the Black community. No, we're starting from the ground up. We're actually looking at what Black families are doing and what roles we're finding men fitting in, being forced to fit into in many respects. Because here's the thing, if you're raised into this, you don't see a problem with it much of the time. And the one person that does see a problem with it is treated like he's crazy. I've said this many times on my show. I fully expected when I grew up and became a man that I would marry a woman with kids. It was never anything anybody told me. It was never something I thought out and said out loud. I just assumed it. I assumed that the first time I married, it would be a woman with kids. That's all I'd seen. That's what I've been cultivated to see. That was a role I was cultivated for. And I've covered this on a show a couple of years ago. I looked at the stats regarding how Black men are perceived as far as being stepfathers. We're actually perceived to be some of the best stepfathers because we're acculturated to it. We're fluid like that, but we've been socialized to be fluid like that. But the problem with that fluidity is it rarely has anything to do with our needs. We have been acculturated to providing for her interests first. So much so, we don't even know what ours are. You ask the average female student, freshman, first week of the semester, can you tell me what your list of requirements are for a man? She can give you a checklist, and I'm telling you this out of years of asking that question. Pretty much the majority of female students I run across can run off a checklist of what they expect from men. What do you think happens when I ask young men the same question? It's crickets. Most men do not have a framework for what they need or what they want in a dynamic. They don't. Because we're not acculturated to set the standards. We're acculturated to receive. We're acculturated to accept what she dictates she wants. And as long as we're interested and attracted to her, that's pretty much all you get. But that dynamic is changing. Men are asking new questions. Men are starting to think about what they get out of all of this sacrifice and realizing And it doesn't come with much. And the irony to all of this shit is men are not really asking for much. They're really not. Nowhere near as much as women are asking for. They're really not. Much of it is rooted around actually wanting to be in a relationship with someone who wants to be with them, but is willing to extend respect and peace. Not a lot to ask for. When you really start looking at the kind of women these brothers are traveling to have relationships with, it's not a long list. Is he attracted to her? Is the intimacy cool? Is she bringing a lot of drama? If you start with just those first 3 checkpoints, you have the majority of men right there. This is what it is. Anyway, just wanted to kind of drop that in there. Give me your thoughts in the comment section. Share with me what your experiences have been. Tell us a little bit about what you see going on, particularly with the family. Let me know. Am I wrong? Am I right? What are your thoughts? All right. Other than that, y'all have a good one, and I will holler at y'all soon. Peace.